They say the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. And for a long time, most of us live by that. We build little fences of comfort around ourselves, believing they keep the bad things out. But sometimes those fences don't just keep the bad things out, they keep the good things in. They keep you stuck, staring at the same patch of grass, while the whole wide world is turning just beyond your sight, and maybe, just maybe, you're missing out on the best parts of it. That's how it was for Marcus. Marcus Miller, 46 years old, going on 60 if you looked at the lines around his eyes. He worked at the K-Mold Plastics plant down on the industrial park, same place for 23 years now. A factory man through and through. You could see it stamped on him, clear as day. His hands told stories without a single word. Broad, calloused palms, knuckles thick as walnuts, the skin ingrained with a fine layer of oil and grime that no amount of scrubbing ever truly banished. They were the hands of a man who worked, who lifted, who pushed and pulled and tightened bolts day in and day out, on machines that hummed and whirred and spat out plastic parts destined for things he never really thought about. Useful hands, dependable hands, but hands that had also gripped a cold beer can 1,000 times after the whistle blew, a welcome kind of tired. His face was a roadmap of long shifts and unspoken compromises. A square jaw, perpetually shadowed by a 5 o'clock stubble that never quite disappeared even after a fresh shave. He wasn't a big man, not in the imposing sense, but he carried his weight with the solid, grounded presence of an old oak tree. His shoulders were a bit stooped, a permanent slump born from years of leaning over workbenches, of carrying the unseen burdens of a blue-collar life. He wasn't one for fuss or flash. Plain work shirts, faded jeans, steel-toed boots were his uniform, his armor against the world. But it was his eyes that really got you. A pale, faded blue, the kind you see in old denim. Most of the time, they were just tired. Glazed over with the predictable rhythm of routine, watching the conveyor belt endlessly, counting the minutes until quitting time. They held a preference for comfort, a quiet avoidance of anything that might ruffle the waters. Confrontation. Marcus would rather walk around a problem than through it, preferring the path of least resistance. Yet beneath that weariness, if you looked close enough, especially when he thought no one was watching, there was a glint, a quiet strength, a flicker of something unfulfilled, a stubborn resilience that hadn't quite been extinguished by the daily grind. It was like seeing a distant fire on a dark night, small, maybe, but still burning. He was the kind of man you'd find at the back of the pub, nursing his single pint, nodding along to conversations but rarely jumping in himself. Not rude, just present. Dependable in his routine, a fixture. You knew where Marcus stood because he always stood in the same spot. He liked the quiet hum of his own thoughts, the predictability of his world. Drama was like a noxious gas, best avoided at all costs. His shift finished. His mind would switch off the factory floor, switch on the path home, and then switch to the comfortable silence of his armchair, the low thrum of the television, a reliable companion. He was solid like a good old pickup truck, maybe a little rusty around the edges, but you knew it'd get you where you needed to go without any fuss or fancy bells and whistles. A man who kept to himself, sure, but the kind of man you could count on to show up, to do his part, to never ask for more than his fair share, and certainly never less. It was a quiet life, a chosen quiet, born not from a lack of things to say, but from a long-ago decision that saying less often meant less trouble, less expectation, less chance of falling short. He'd built a reputation on being steady, reliable, and unobtrusive. He didn't rock the boat because, frankly, rocking the boat felt like work, and after 40 hours of solid graft, the last thing Marcus wanted was more work. So he stayed within his lines, followed the rules, and kept his head down. It wasn't ambition that drove him, not anymore if it ever truly had. It was the simple, unvarnished desire for ease, for the path of least resistance, for the comfort of knowing what tomorrow would bring, because it would likely bring exactly what yesterday had. A simple life, some might call it. A life defined by what it wasn't, rather than what it was destined to be. That kind of simple, quiet life had a rhythm to it, a slow, steady pulse that had been Marcus's for years now. It started every morning before the sun even thought about stretching, the clock on the bedside table glowing a stark, unforgiving 5:00 a.m. A grunt, a stretch that never quite reached the spots that needed it, then the familiar creak of the floorboards underfoot. Sarah, his wife, would usually be stirring by then too, a quiet rustle from the other side of the bed. No grand pronouncements, no dramatic declarations, just the steady march of another day beginning. Coffee, black and strong, was the first order of business. While it brewed, he'd stare out the kitchen window, the street still dark and quiet, save for the occasional early bird heading for their own grind. He knew those cars, knew the hum of their engines as they passed. A silent brotherhood of the dawn shift. Then it was lunch packed, always the same sandwich, a piece of fruit, maybe a handful of chips if Sarah had bought the big bag, and out the door before the first hint of orange smudged the horizon. The drive to the factory was short, a mental warm-up for the drone of the machines. He knew the building like the back of his calloused hand, the faint metallic tang in the air, the rhythmic clang and hiss that was the soundtrack to his working life. For 46 years, those hands had learned the language of steel and grease, of conveyor belts and punch presses. They were strong, those hands, scarred in places, the nails perpetually stained. They were good hands, honest hands, but they were also tired hands, hands that carried the weight of a life spent building things for other people, always just a cog in a bigger machine. His job was assembly, specific and repetitive. Pick up part A, mate it with part B, tighten bolt C, send it down the line. Thousands of times a day, 5 days a week, sometimes 6. It paid the bills, mostly. Kept a roof over their heads, food on the table, clothes on the kids' backs. But the bills, they seemed to be breeding lately. Utility statements that stretched longer than his arm, the rising cost of groceries, the endless demands of 2 teenagers. Emily, 17, would be looking at college soon if they could swing it. David, 13, was growing like a weed, needing new shoes every other month. The budget was a tightrope walk, one misstep away from a tumble. Every year the raise was just enough to keep pace with the cost of living, never enough to get ahead, never enough to breathe easy. He'd see guys at work, younger men mostly, talking about promotions, about going back to school, about starting their own side hustles. Marcus would just nod, maybe grunt in agreement, and turn back to his machine. He had those thoughts once, a long time ago. Flickers of ambition, little sparks that used to ignite in his gut. A dream of managing the floor, maybe even owning a small workshop of his own. But the sparks had always fizzled out, doused by the cold water of fatigue, the fear of failure, the overwhelming comfort of the familiar. Inside him, buried deep under layers of routine and resignation, was a quiet shame. A fear that he was stuck, truly stuck, and that his kids, Emily and David, saw it. He wanted them to be proud of him, to see him as more than just the guy who came home tired every night, smelling faintly of machine oil. He wanted Sarah to look at him with something more than just affection and quiet understanding. He wanted a flicker of the respect she'd held for the ambitious young man she'd married. But he rarely acknowledged this ambition, even to himself. It was safer to just keep it locked away, another unread bill shoved to the bottom of the pile. The flaw in Marcus wasn't a malicious one. It was a gentle, insidious pull towards ease. That cold beer after work, the numbing glow of the TV, the simple pleasure of not having to think too hard. It wasn't laziness, not exactly. It was a deep-seated apprehension that trying and failing would be worse than not trying at all. That the sting of disappointment for himself and for his family would be a heavier burden than the quiet regret he already carried. So he endured, a silent, stubborn loyalty to his comfortable, if unfulfilling, existence. He had a strength, all right, the strength of a man who could take a hit and keep standing, but it was a passive strength, one that kept him weathering the storm rather than steering the ship. He was loyal to his family, yes, but that loyalty had translated into providing the bare minimum of stability, not the vibrant future he secretly yearned to offer. His world was small, predictable, and steadily shrinking, and he knew it even if he never said a word. The 5 a.m. alarm wasn't a jolt, not anymore. It was a familiar low hum, a gentle, insistent nudge that pulled Marcus from a shallow, dreamless sleep. Every workday morning, the same gray light filtered through the thin blinds of his bedroom window. He'd swing his feet to the worn linoleum floor, the chill a familiar jolt, and begin the quiet, practiced ballet of a man preparing for another day that would look exactly like the last. Coffee, black and bitter, was the first ritual. Then, a quick bowl of cereal, eaten in silence at the kitchen table while Sarah and the kids still slept. He'd catch the local news on the small, flickering TV, the drone of anchors discussing distant problems, a perfect backdrop to the quiet erosion of his own ambition. The drive to the factory was short, a familiar blur of residential streets giving way to industrial parks. The air grew heavier with the scent of metal and exhaust, the rhythm of his tires on the cracked asphalt, a steady, unchanging drumbeat. Inside the plant, it was a world of clanking machinery, the whine of conveyor belts and the ceaseless thrum of powerful engines. For 8, sometimes 10 hours a day, Marcus stood on his feet, operating a press that stamped out parts for car engines. It was a job he knew intimately, every lever, every gauge, every groan of the machine. He could do it in his sleep, and sometimes he felt like he was. The work wasn't mentally challenging, not really, but it demanded a consistent physical presence, a steady hand, and a mind kept just engaged enough to avoid accidents. He was a cog, a reliable, well-oiled cog in a much larger machine, and his greatest skill was showing up day in and day out, no fuss, no drama. The pay was decent enough to keep the lights on, keep food on the table, but that was it. Just enough. Every month felt like a delicate dance, shuffling bills around, deciding which one could wait another week, another month. The car needed new brakes. The furnace groaned with an ominous wheeze, and Emily's school trip suddenly became an unspoken impossibility. He'd see the worry etched around Sarah's eyes when she'd open the mail, the way she'd sigh a little too deeply when David asked for new sneakers. He hated that sigh. He hated feeling the weight of their unspoken wants, the silent acknowledgement that there just wasn't enough. Not for college funds, not for vacations, not for anything beyond the bare, unremarkable necessities of their blue-collar life. Beneath the steady rhythm of his routine, beneath the quiet gruffness and the preference for comfort, a slow burn of resentment simmered. It wasn't aimed at anyone in particular, just at the situation, at himself. He saw other men at the factory, younger guys, talking about online courses, evening certifications, promotions. He heard their plans, their ambitions, and a familiar ache would start in his chest. He remembered a time when he had plans, too, ambitions that felt as real and tangible as the steel he pressed all day. He'd imagined himself in a supervisor's office, maybe even running his own small shop, building something with his hands, something that required more than just repetitive motion. He'd even thought about going back to school once, years ago, for a drafting certificate, but the paperwork felt overwhelming, the commitment too large, and the lure of a cold beer after a long shift was always stronger. He'd always imagined a bigger life for his kids, a life where they didn't have to worry about the cost of textbooks or the price of groceries. He'd wanted them to have choices, real choices, not just the ones dictated by a paycheck that barely stretched. But as the years blurred into one another, those dreams became like old photographs, tucked away in a dusty album, rarely looked at, the faces faded, the edges curled. He was a good man, he told himself, a dependable man. But the man he saw in the cracked mirror wasn't the man he'd once hoped to be, and the gap between the two grew wider with each passing year, a chasm filled with unspoken regrets and the quiet whisper of, "What if?" He knew deep down he was stuck. And the terrifying part was, he was the one who had built his own prison of comfort, brick by easy brick. Then came the Tuesday evening that put a crack right through that comfortable prison, right through the quiet hum of his easy life. It was just after dinner. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, and the air held that warm, dusty smell of late summer. Marcus was out in the garage, just puttering around, pretending to sort some old tools, but mostly just enjoying the silence before the dishes got clanked and the TV started up. He could hear Emily and her friend, Chloe, talking out on the porch swing, their voices a low murmur that usually just blended into the background noise of the neighborhood. He was wrestling with a stubborn wrench, trying to loosen a bolt on an old bicycle David had dragged home, when a phrase drifted clear through the screen door, sharper than any metal cutting through silence. "Yeah, but I don't think I'm even gonna bother applying to many places," Emily said, her voice sounding tired, resigned in a way a 17-year-old's voice shouldn't. "College, I mean, what's the point? We can't afford it anyway." Marcus froze. The wrench slipped from his grip and clattered to the concrete floor with a sound that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the sudden stillness of his own mind. "We can't afford it anyway." It wasn't angry, not resentful. It was just fact, stated so plainly, so casually, like talking about the weather. Like it was simply the truth of their lives and had been for a long, long time. The weight of that casual defeat landed on him like a physical blow, right in the gut. He felt the blood drain from his face, a cold rush. That quiet acceptance in her voice, that was the same quiet acceptance he'd heard in his own head for years, every time he'd thought about a promotion or a class or anything that meant stepping outside the lines. He looked at his hands, calloused, stained with grease, suddenly seeing them not as symbols of hard work, but of stagnation. He saw his comfortable apathy reflected in his daughter's tired surrender, a future he hadn't prepared for, a dream he'd inadvertently choked. The clatter of the wrench faded, but those words were branded into him, burning. He didn't say anything. He didn't walk out there, didn't try to reassure her. He just stood there in the garage, the faint smell of oil and old dust heavy in the air, the last rays of sun fading fast, leaving him in the encroaching gloom. He heard Emily and Chloe change the subject, moving on to lighter things, but Marcus couldn't move. Couldn't breathe, really. His fleeting comfort had just cost his family their future, spoken aloud by the one person he'd sworn to protect from his own mistakes. That night, Marcus didn't sleep. He sat in the worn armchair in the living room, the TV off, the house dark and quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. It was past 3 a.m. The pale glow from the streetlights outside cast long, eerie shadows across the familiar furniture. He had a cold beer in his hand, a cheap lager, but it tasted flat bitter. He took a sip, then set it down on the coaster Sarah had made in ceramics class years ago, a chipped, slightly ugly thing that always made him smile. Tonight it just looked sad. He stared at nothing, the words replaying in his head, a relentless loop. We can't afford it anyway. What had he done? What had his life become? He'd built this house, brick by brick, bought these things, filled these rooms with his family. He'd worked hard, damn hard, every single day. But for what? To give his daughter a future where she just assumed she couldn't even try. He saw himself, suddenly, for who he really was. Not a good provider, not a strong father, but a man who had chosen the path of least resistance at every turn. He'd chased comfort like a dog chasing a rabbit, fast, mindless, always for the immediate gratification. A few extra hours of sleep, a beer, a TV show, avoiding the paperwork for a course, avoiding the uncomfortable conversation about a promotion. Every time he'd told himself it was fine, it could wait, it wasn't that important. But it was important. God, it was the only thing that was important. The silence of the house pressed in on him, heavy with the weight of his wasted years. He thought of all those buried dreams, those ambitions he'd let rust away like the tools in his garage. The gap between the man he was and the man he'd wanted to be wasn't just a crack anymore. It was a gaping wound, bleeding regret. He was stuck, just like he'd always feared. But worse, he realized he hadn't just stuck himself. He was sticking his family, too. He was the anchor, not the sail. A deep, unfamiliar ache settled in his chest, colder than the beer, heavier than any shift he'd ever worked. He thought about Emily's face when she'd said it, no anger, just quiet acceptance. And for the first time, Marcus understood that his biggest fear wasn't failure itself. It was the fear of trying and failing. The fear of that disappointment, that effort being for nothing. But what he had now, this quiet, comfortable stagnation, this was a far worse failure. He was failing his kids by teaching them that their dreams had to shrink to fit the limits of their bank account, limits he himself had unconsciously drawn. He had traded tomorrow's chances for tonight's ease, and the cost was looking him right in the eye at 3 a.m. in the empty, accusing quiet of his own home. He closed his eyes, a single, raw truth burning itself into his soul. This cannot be it. He lay there staring at the ceiling, the glow from the digital clock on his nightstand painting stark numbers across the plaster. 3:17 a.m. This cannot be it. The words echoed, not in anger, but with a quiet, undeniable finality. It wasn't a scream, wasn't a promise to himself in the heat of a moment. It was a cold, hard fact settling deep in his bones. This was the floor. He'd hit it. He pushed himself up, the mattress springs groaning under his weight, a sound as tired as he felt. He didn't go for another beer, didn't turn on the TV. He just sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. He felt a strange emptiness, a void where the easy comfort used to live. But beneath it, a tiny, unfamiliar spark. It wasn't hope yet, not really. It was just a space cleared out, waiting for something else. The sun was still hours from thinking about rising when Marcus finally moved. He padded out to the kitchen, made himself a cup of instant coffee, bitter, strong, no sugar. He sat at the chipped formica table, the same table where Emily had eaten her cereal, where David left his homework. And he just sat. He didn't know what came next, didn't have a plan, but the decision had been made, solid and unyielding. The easy path, the comfortable path, was closed. He had chosen. He would find another way. That morning, the 5 a.m. alarm still ripped him from a fitful sleep, but something was different. The dread was still there, the weariness, but it was accompanied by a new, almost imperceptible tension. A resolve. He went through the motions of his morning ritual, but his mind wasn't on the taste of his coffee or the squeak of his work boots. It was still circling that quiet declaration. This cannot be it. The factory floor hummed with its usual mechanical drone. Marcus welded, lifted, sorted, his body moving on autopilot, but his thoughts were buzzing, restless. He kept replaying Emily's voice, the resignation. And then the words from the flyer he'd glanced at 100 times on the break room bulletin board, always dismissing it as not for him. Night classes, get certified, advance your career. That night after dinner, after helping David with his math, after Sarah had settled onto the couch with her book, Marcus found himself standing in front of the TV. His hand hovered over the remote, the familiar pull towards mindless escape, a tangible force. Just one show, Marcus. You're tired. You earned it. The fridge hummed, a silent invitation for a cold one. For years, this had been his reward, his unwind, his comfort. He took a deep breath, the air thick with the scent of Sarah's pot roast. He pictured Emily's face again. He saw the future he had been passively building for them, a future where their dreams were limited by his inaction. He felt the cold truth he'd recognized at 3 a.m. He was trading tomorrow's chances for tonight's ease. His hand dropped from the remote. He walked past the couch, past the humming fridge, and into the small, cluttered room he called his office, really just a desk crammed into the corner of the spare bedroom. The old desktop computer sat there, thick with dust. He hadn't used it for anything but paying bills in years. He pressed the power button. The screen flickered to life with a familiar, slow groan. It felt like an act of monumental effort, a physical struggle against years of ingrained habit. He wanted to sit down, wanted to turn on the game, wanted that beer. Every fiber of his being screamed for the known comfort. But he didn't. He opened the browser. His fingers, usually so confident with a wrench, felt clumsy on the keyboard. He typed slowly, deliberately. Night classes trade certificate. The words felt heavy, alien. He clicked, search. The screen filled with links, a whole new world opening up, one he had always pretended didn't exist for him. Started scrolling, his eyes scanning for welding, for machining, for anything that didn't feel like a foreign language. The options were overwhelming. The tuition fees made his stomach clench. The commitment felt impossibly huge. He felt the old fear rise, hot and stinging. You can't do this, Marcus. You'll just fail. You're not smart enough. You're too old. The whispers of procrastination, cloaked in self-doubt, were deafening. His eyes drifted to the clock. 8:47 p.m. He could still catch the game. He could still grab a beer. No one would know. He could just close the lid, forget about it. Say he tried. He took another deep breath. This was it. This was the moment. The decision wasn't just made at 3 a.m. It was made right now in this quiet, dusty room, fighting the ingrained comfort. He leaned closer to the screen, forcing himself to read, to understand, to step into the uncomfortable. It was hard. God, it was so much harder than doing nothing. But as he started to click on a link for a local community college, a different kind of feeling bloomed in his chest. It wasn't peace, not yet. It was something sharper, something like purpose. He was trading that fleeting comfort, that cold beer and TV, for a shot at something real, something lasting. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus didn't feel stuck. He felt like he was finally moving. The next morning, the alarm screamed at 4:30 a.m. Marcus blinked, his eyelids heavy, a lead weight pulling them back down. The purpose he'd felt last night was a distant echo, muffled by the relentless demand of the factory whistle that would soon follow. He'd signed up for an intro to welding course online, an evening class 3 nights a week. He'd bought the books, downloaded the software. Now, the actual doing of it felt like trying to lift a car with his bare hands. He dragged himself out of bed, the floor cold against his feet. Sarah was still asleep, a gentle murmur of breath. He made coffee, strong and black, the only true friend at this hour. He tried to read the first chapter of his textbook. Basic arc welding principles, but the words swam before his eyes. His brain, accustomed to coasting, rebelled violently against the new demand. He stared at the page, comprehension a slippery fish he couldn't quite grasp. The familiar pang of inadequacy rose. See, told ya, you ain't got it. Work was a blur of aching muscles and the same repetitive motions. Usually he'd clock out, grab a cheap six-pack, and collapse in front of the TV. Tonight the TV was dark. The beer stayed in the fridge. Instead, he forced himself into the spare room, smelling faintly of old books and forgotten hobbies. His daughter, Emily, had left her college brochures on his desk. He picked one up, her smiling face looking out from the glossy cover. That was enough. For today, the first few nights were brutal. He'd come home, eat dinner with a forced smile, then disappear into his studies. The exhaustion was a constant companion, a heavy cloak he couldn't shake. His eyes burned, his head throbbed. He missed the simple comfort of just being done for the day. Sarah noticed. You okay, hun? You look thinner. He just grunted, not wanting to put words to the silent war waging inside him. One Tuesday, after a particularly grueling shift that had him practically moving steel beams by hand, he sat at his desk, staring at the blank screen of the online lecture. His brain felt like wet sand. He could barely string two thoughts together, let alone absorb the intricacies of amperage and voltage. The temptation was a siren song, whispering of a cold beer, a comfortable couch, the blessed oblivion of a sports game. He rubbed his temples, his vision blurring. He could just skip it. One night, who would know? He closed the laptop. The click echoed in the quiet room. He walked to the fridge, pulled out a frosty can. He popped the top, the hiss loud in the silence. He raised it to his lips, and then he stopped. He looked at the condensation beating on the can, the familiar comfort of it in his hand. He heard Emily's voice again, that quiet defeat. "We can't afford it anyway." He set the beer down unopened. The cold condensation left a ring on the counter. He walked back to the spare room, his legs feeling like lead. He opened the laptop. He rewound the lecture, and this time he watched. He didn't understand half of it, but he watched. He took notes, scrawled and messy, but he took them. He was still tired, still felt stupid, but he didn't quit. Not tonight. Days bled into weeks. There were nights he fell asleep at the desk, head slumped onto the textbook, drool staining the page. There were quizzes he bombed, making him question everything. The factory work didn't get easier, and adding hours of mental strain on top of physical labor felt like running a marathon with a sack of bricks on his back. David, his son, asked why he was always doing homework like a kid. Emily, though, she just watched him with a quiet curiosity, a flicker of something new in her eyes. He wanted to quit every single day. The old Marcus, the one who craved ease, screamed at him constantly. "This is stupid. You're too old for this. You're just making yourself miserable." But every morning he woke up bruised and weary, and every evening he opened that book or logged into that lecture. It wasn't about being smart. It was about showing up. It was about proving to himself and to Emily that some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight felt like it was tearing him apart. He might stumble, he might crawl, but he kept moving forward. Each struggle, each almost quit, each little victory of endurance was hardening something inside him. It was forging a new kind of strength. Then one Tuesday, something shifted. He was struggling with a particularly stubborn diagram for hydraulic systems, a mess of lines and valves that always made his eyes cross. He'd been at it for an hour, about to slam the laptop shut, when a memory surfaced from the factory floor, a leaky valve on the old stamping machine. He pictured it, the actual physical thing, and suddenly the diagram clicked. It wasn't just abstract lines anymore, it was real. He felt a jolt, not of exhaustion, but of understanding. A small spark of genuine pride. That week the shift foreman, old Manelli, pulled him aside. "Marcus," he grunted, "you been looking at that number 3 press funny lately, like you know something I don't." Marcus just shrugged, but Manelli continued, "Used to be you just patched it up. Last 2 times you found the real problem before it became a real problem. What's different?" Marcus still just mumbled, "Just trying to pay attention." But something in his posture, a subtle straightening of his shoulders, spoke volumes. At home, Sarah noticed the change too. He was still tired, sometimes beyond tired, but the blank, distant look in his eyes was gone. He'd come to dinner, smelling of grease and the faint scent of textbooks, but he'd actually be there. He'd listen when David talked about his video games, asking real questions. He'd even offer to help Emily with a math problem once, surprising them both with a knack for breaking down complex equations into simpler parts, a skill honed by dismantling complicated machinery on paper. The house started to feel different, a little lighter. The first real breakthrough came a few months later. He aced a particularly tough exam, when he thought he'd fail for sure. He walked out of the community college testing center that night feeling 10 feet tall, the cold night air doing nothing to dampen the warmth spreading through his chest. He wasn't just surviving, he was learning. He was winning. When the certificate arrived in the mail, crisp and official, he didn't know what to do with it. Sarah framed it and hung it in the kitchen, right next to Emily's graduation photo from middle school. It felt heavy, substantial, not just a piece of paper, but a monument to all those nights of sacrifice. Then came the bigger changes. A new opening came up at the plant for a maintenance supervisor. The old Marcus would have scoffed, thought it was for someone smarter, someone with more credentials. This Marcus, the one forged in the fire of late nights and tough choices, applied. He interviewed. He told them about the night classes, about the hours he'd put in. He got the job. The pay raise was significant, enough to stop the quiet worries about bills for good. Enough for Sarah to talk about fixing the porch, about a proper family vacation. And enough, most importantly, to sit Emily down one evening at the kitchen table, the certificate gleaming on the wall behind him, and tell her, clear as a bell, Emily, you want to go to college? You apply wherever you want. We got this. I got this. The look on her face, the way her eyes widened, then filled with a hope he hadn't seen in years that was worth every lost hour of sleep, every missed beer. Marcus, at 46, was still a factory man. His hands were still calloused, his eyes still held the wisdom of long shifts. But the quiet strength wasn't just in his gaze anymore. It was in his posture, in the way he carried himself. He spoke with a newfound confidence, not boastful but assured. He still liked his quiet evenings, but they were different now. Sometimes he'd find himself working through a problem in his head, an engineer's puzzle, or helping David with a tricky science project, his mind sharp, engaged. He wasn't avoiding effort, he was seeking it out. He wasn't running from challenges, he was meeting them head-on. I used to think easy was good, Marcus would say sometimes, leaning against the rail overlooking the humming factory floor, a knowing look in his eye. Turns out easy just keeps you stuck, spinning your wheels. Real good takes work, and sometimes you gotta trade a little bit of tonight's comfort, that cold beer, that TV show, for all of tomorrow's chances. It ain't about being smart, not entirely. It's about being willing to try even when